Now, it's an interesting question. Why hasn't fusion matured into a functioning technology? Well, let's take a look at some other technologies and see how they've matured over the years. Nuclear bombs went to nuclear power all over the world in a few decades. Planes went from this to this in just over 50 years. Transistors, of course, took over the world, as did liquid crystal displays. All of these started from niche, novelty, scientific observations and went on to change the world. Although it must be said that most of these things took decades to mature. Which is why, whenever you see a channel putting out hundreds of videos per year on how this, that, and the other technology will change everything, you know it's all bullshit. But merging atoms to generate energy, that would be fusion, has been around almost as long as splitting them to make energy, that would be fission. So why did one of these mature into a technology while the other languished? Well, in order to understand that, we're going to have to take a look at a place where fusion takes place on a daily basis: the sun. The thing is that even in the sun, at incomprehensible pressures and temperatures, fusion is still incredibly rare. So the sun fuses some 600 odd million tons of hydrogen into helium every second, but that probably won't mean much to anyone. So let's put that into more human terms. A cubic meter of water weighs a ton. So this is 1 cubic meter, which I assure you, if you have to get inside it, is pretty cramped. And so a cubic kilometer of water weighs 1 billion tons. So 500 million tons is basically half of that. So we basically want a 1 kilometer cube, and then we'll chop it in half and put it on Manhattan. But of all that fusion that takes place, not all of it is turned into energy. Only about 4 million tons of this is turned from matter into energy. Now, the volume of the Empire State Building is about 1 million cubic meters. So filled with water, this would be about 1 million tons. So more or less, the sun turns 4 of those every second from matter into energy. Now, if we spread that over the volume of the sun, it's not actually a lot. I mean, the Empire State Building might seem like a fairly big building to you and me, but on the scale of the planet, not so much. Then when you put the planet on the same scale as the sun, yeah, at this point you start to feel just a little bit small. So when you hear that the sun is turning 4 million tons of matter into energy every second, you've got to keep these things in perspective with the size of the sun. Yeah, in terms of fusion per mass of the sun, there's really not a lot of it going on. But then you realize it ain't a constant density blob. If it were, the overall density of the sun would be just higher than that of water, but not quite as high as rocks. Meanwhile, the bit of the sun that you can actually see, the glowy blobby thing in the sky, that's pretty diffuse stuff. Water is about 1 ton for a cubic meter. The air you're breathing at the moment is about 1,000 times lower in density at about 1 kilogram per cubic meter. But the bit of the sun you can see, the density of that is somewhere between 100 and 1,000 times lower than the density of the air that you're breathing. Now, I know what a lot of people will say. The bit of the sun that you can see has lower density than our atmosphere, and it's made of hydrogen. But how can that be? We can see through hydrogen. Why does it look like a glowing ball? Let's start with something that we're all fairly familiar with. Water covers most of the surface of our planet, falls from the sky occasionally, and makes up most of your body. Now, if we were to zoom into a little drop of water, this is what you would see. This is actually a molecular dynamics simulation of water. It's about 1 billionth of a meter in size and about 1 billionth of a second that you're looking at. And you see there are molecules there, water molecules, that are moving around with a fairly characteristic speed. That's essentially the temperature of the water. To a reasonable approximation, if I were to conduct this simulation at a higher temperature, the main difference you would notice is the molecules would be moving faster. Now, this is the really critical bit. If we were to plot up how many molecules have how much energy, so let's do that, this line here will be the amount of energy, the speed the molecules are going at. And we're going to plot up the probability on the other axis. We're going to get a characteristic curve like this, and it's going to be biased towards lower energies for the colder solution and higher energies for the hotter solution. And you can see that most of the water molecules are stuck together in a ball, like magnets. This is actually an electrostatic interaction we call hydrogen bonds. So the molecules are essentially in energy pits that they can't get out of. But every now and again, a lucky molecule has enough energy to break the last hydrogen bond holding it to the surface, and a water molecule leaves the droplet. We call this process evaporation. So bringing it all together, this is the amount of energy you need to break those hydrogen bonds and leave the water droplet. And this was our plot of the kinetic energy of the molecules versus the probability. So you can quite easily see there is a small probability that a molecule will have the energy to overcome the hydrogen bond and leave the droplet. And as the water droplet gets hotter, there are more that have the energy to leave the droplet and evaporate. And if you understood all of that, congratulations, you now have a level of physical understanding of the world that encompasses basically the entire known universe, from how water evaporates to how the nerves in your brain fire to how the surface of the sun is an opaque plasma. I guess with hindsight, this is probably something they should teach in schools. You see, water ain't the only thing that can evaporate. You get hydrogen atoms hot enough, and eventually the electrons start to evaporate off the nuclei. Ballpark figures, water starts to evaporate at about 300 Kelvin, room temperature. Electrons start to evaporate at about 3000 Kelvin. And now you have this soup of hydrogen nuclei and electrons called a plasma. And that evaporation is well underway at the temperature of the surface of the sun, some 6000 Kelvin. And this is why the top few hundred kilometers of the sun, and for reference, the entirety of the Earth's atmosphere is about 100 kilometers thick. That top few hundred kilometers of the sun goes from almost completely opaque, basically foggy, to at the top being almost completely transparent. And that's basically because of the dilution effect, that the density of the plasma has dropped by a factor of about 100 by the time you get to the top of the atmosphere, and you can see through most of it. So you can see through hundreds of kilometers of Earth's atmosphere because the electrons are bound to the nuclei. But you heat it up to the temperature of the surface of the sun, and you're going to get a plasma, and the visibility will drop to almost zero. As you go deeper into the sun, the density and the temperature both increase. In fact, just like with the Earth, most of the density of the sun is a small blob in the middle called the core. Here, the density isn't the modest density of water, but getting up for 100 times that of the density of water. And the temperature isn't a mild 6000 Kelvin like it is on the surface of the sun, but about 6 million Kelvin. Now, at this point, in water terms, we're way past boiling the water. And at this point, all of the electrons have been boiled off the atoms. And the density is way above what you would have in even a metal. Maybe the nearest metaphor that you could get on Earth is if you took a piece of metal and heated it up to 1,000 or so degrees. So if you were to make this 100 or so times denser and 1,000 or so times hotter, these would be the conditions of the core of the sun. And this is where about a third of the mass of the sun lies. But it doesn't really matter. Even here, the amount of fusion going on is almost non-existent. Remember what I was saying earlier? It's about 4 Empire State Buildings worth of mass being converted into energy every second. And that's even at 100 times the density of water and 10 or so million degrees. And something that is slow under these conditions is going to be really, really hard to replicate in the lab. Because even at temperatures that replicate merely the surface of the sun, every material in existence has already melted, and a reasonable proportion of them have ionized into plasma. Now, at this point, you've got to get something like 10,000 times hotter, and at this point, fusion will just about happen at a very, very, very slow boil, like it does on the sun. And the only reason the sun's temperature is so hot is because it's a very big ball and can only lose energy via radiation on the top layer. So if you just do the rough calculations, 4 Empire States mass of energy conversion per second divided by the mass of the sun, you're looking at a power generation of about 0.1 watts per kilogram. Humans, for reference, run at about 100 watts and weigh about 100 kilos, so humans run at about 1 watt per kilo. So you generate more power per kilo than the sun. Now, a regular kettle runs at about 2000 watts, and if you were to put that energy into a kilo of water, that would be heating at about 20,000 times the rate that the sun generates power. Basically, trying to replicate fusion like you have in the sun on the earth would just be way, way, way too slow. You need to get power generation from your kilo of hydrogen that is hundreds to thousands to millions of times faster than that you would have on the sun. Now, recently, the National Ignition Facility managed to use about 300 units of energy to create 2 units of laser power, which it put onto a target to get 3 units of energy out via fusion, which was basically a flash of heat, of which 0 was turned into anything useful. But when you look at the rate of fusion that they had, it's kind of crazy. The whole thing lasted more or less a billionth of a second and produced about 2 million joules. That's more or less enough energy to vaporize, turn into steam, a kilo of water. The sort of thing that would take a kettle 15 minutes to do. So if that's what it does in a billionth of a second, it would be 2 million gigajoules per second. That's 2 million gigawatts from something about the size of a drop of water. That's about 10 milligrams. But whatever, let's call it a gram to make our numbers easy. So a kilo of the sun generated about a tenth of a watt, a kilo of human generated about 1 watt, a kilo of this stuff would generate 2 billion watts per kilo. Yes, but the conditions could only be maintained for about a billionth of a second on a millionth of a gram. And therein lies the problem. Getting conditions where fusion can take place requires temperatures hot enough that they will melt and boil every material that exists and turn it into a plasma. But even if you could get it to work, all you're going to do with that extra energy is use it to boil water and turn it into useful energy. Now let's compare merging atoms in fusion to splitting them in fission. Here you're not trying to collide positively charged nuclei together, so you don't need these absurdly high energies that only really happen inside the center of stars. Now you have to collide neutrons, which are neutral, with nuclei, so there is no great electrostatic barrier here. In fact, these will quite happily happen at room temperature. Each nuclei you split with fission releases about 10 times as much energy as fusing 2 hydrogen atoms together. The downside, of course, is that the fragments that you get off your split atoms are radioactive, but it's not as bad as people think. So Chernobyl was the worst conceivable nuclear disaster. Nothing remotely like it has ever happened since, and is honestly impossible with modern reactor design. The core meltdown is the worst thing that can happen with a nuclear reactor. You see, nuclear reactors are just glorified water boilers. The usual way that you run those is you generate enough power to boil water. However, if you screw it up and your reactor generates a lot more energy than the water can take away, the core just gets hotter and hotter, and eventually it melts, which is a disaster because now your billion-dollar nuclear power station isn't going to make any more power. Secondly, the melted down core is one of the most horrifically radioactive things on the planet. Exposure to the high energy particles coming off an active core, let alone a melting down one, will give you a fatal dose in seconds. Although I should mention in passing that the exact same thing is true of the high energy particles coming off a fusion power plant. The thing that's dangerous is the high energy particles which you get off either splitting or merging the nuclei, and those are very dangerous to organic life. However, they're also quite effective at heating things up and boiling water. The difference is, of course, that with a fission power plant where you're splitting the atoms, the fragments are still radioactive for an extended period of time, which is only true to a lesser extent with fusion. But let's take a look at how bad this stuff really is. So, Chernobyl, the site of the world's worst nuclear disaster, which has actually been pretty good for the environment. Yes, I did say that right. Turns out the 30-kilometer exclusion zone with somewhat higher radiation levels may or may not have had some detrimental effects on the wildlife. I mean, I've personally seen plants growing quite happily in the spoils of a uranium mine with over 100 times background radiation.
So you sort of stick it under a plant somewhere, and immediately goes to the high radiation alarm. That's 50 times background, 100 times background, 120 times background-ish. So it's 100 times background just by the roadside in America.
And if you're wondering why I'm not freaking out at 100 times background, isn't that lethal? It turns out you get 30 times background when you're on a plane at altitude. And with some 6-odd million people flying per day, if there were some detrimental effects from flying, I think someone would have spotted it by now. And when I say that Chernobyl really is as bad as it gets, well, let's take a look at Fukushima, where the radiation map here certainly looks bad. Until you realize that the absolute highest radiation contour level on this map is only about twice the radiation levels you would get on a plane at altitude, and is actually lower than the spoils of this uranium mine. And yes, uranium is just an ore that you mine out of the ground, and that was right by the roadside in America. So yeah, you just dig uranium out of the ground, and whilst it's radioactive, it turns out it's much more chemically toxic than it is a radiation hazard. It's basically impossible to kill yourself by acute radiation poisoning by uranium because it'll chemically kill you a long time before that. Not quite so with tritium, the favored fuel at the core of all modern fusion efforts, because deuterium-tritium requires the least intense conditions to get it working. Tritium is about 1 billion times more radioactive than uranium, with the fatal radiation dose for tritium in acute radiation poisoning being about 1/1000th of a gram, making the fuel for fusion one of the most toxic things on Earth. But for certain, Chernobyl's no radioactive wasteland. You can see that from the satellite photo. But the complete exclusion of human activity from this zone has made this one of the most pristine and virgin wildlife habitats on Earth. I know what you might be thinking. Okay, that's outside the reactor where not much of the radiation actually got out. What about inside the reactor? When the core melted down, it created something called an elephant foot, which is where the molten core basically leached out of the bottom of the core. And at the time, that would have been the most radioactive thing on the planet. Just to stand by it would have been instant death. All hot and toasty with all the short half-life, super radioactive stuff like tritium. But of course, the active stuff is only screamingly radioactive for a short period of time. Then it's all just decayed away, which is why now, here we are some 30 years later, and people have actually had their photo taken next to the elephant foot. Fissile materials like uranium, thorium, and plutonium, there is no shortage of. And reactor designs make thermal runaways like that happened in Chernobyl simply impossible. And therein lies the fundamental difference between fusion and fission. With what? You need conditions something like 1 million times more intense than you get in the center of the sun. No materials can hold that because at those temperatures, everything has long since turned into plasma. Now, these conditions can be maintained on Earth for microseconds, which if you're doing your compression with a fission nuke can honestly be plenty, and will happily turn a 1,000-ton type explosion into a 1,000,000-ton type explosion. But not so easy for power plants. Well, you get folks who want to hold this plasma at millions of degrees using superconducting magnets like the ITER. Of course, you can do, but you do kind of have to scratch your head and wonder at this. To get the magnetic fields strong enough, you need superconducting magnets held at 4 degrees above absolute zero, right next to the walls, which, if your fusion is working right, are going to be absorbing megawatts of thermal energy from those high energy particles. I think that's what they call an intrinsic problem. And this is why fusion has always languished and never, over the years, evolved into a functioning technology, whilst fission, over the same time period, has evolved into a stable and safe way of reproducibly generating power. And that's today's video. If you enjoyed it, maybe consider dropping a thumbs up on it. And videos like this are made possible by the kind support of people on Patreon. And if you want to become one of them, links below. And as ever, thanks for watching.